Students, please note that today's topic that we are going to discuss is from the first chapter, and the topic that we are going to study here is on functional relationships, constants, and variables. Now, what are functional relationships? We know that economics is a science which studies the relationship among various variables. These relationships are expressed in symbols of algebra. Functional relationships explain the cause and effect relationship among variables. Or, in simple, they illustrate the interdependence of the variables. Economics uses various concepts or variables like demand, supply, cost, revenue, price, consumption, production, income, savings, investments, etc. All these are used in economics. You would have come across all these variables. All these variables are measurable and they are interdependent variables. Their interdependency is always shown through functional relationships. Now, here, what this functional relationship explains the dependence of one variable on the other. We know that variables are generally interdependent. The behavior of one variable to the changes in the value of other variables is called a functional relationship. Now let's see one kind of a functional relationship. Normally, a functional relationship is expressed in one of these ways. Now, for example, we write D is equal to F of P. Now, what is D here? D refers to demand, P refers to price, and F refers to functional relationship. We call this, that is D is equal to F of P, as a demand function. That is a functional relationship. It shows the dependence of demand on price. In this case, that is D is equal to F of P, demand is a dependent variable. P is an independent variable. Demand depends upon price. That's why we say D as a dependent variable and P as an independent variable. Why do we say P as an independent variable? Because P changes first, due to which demand also changes. That's why we say P as an independent variable and D as a dependent variable. Similarly, we have another functional relationship, namely the supply function. How do we write that? We write it as S is equal to F of P. What does that mean? Supply has a functional relationship with price. Here S is equal to F of P. S refers to supply, P to price, and F2 functional relationship. This we call it as a supply function. It shows the dependence of one variable with the other. So we say supply depends upon price. So here supply is a dependent variable and P is an independent variable because P changes first, due to which supply also changes. So these are the two functions. So similarly, we can have several functions. Whenever there are two variables depending on each other, we can write it in a form of a functional relationship. Now, these functional relationships may be either positive or negative. When you say positive relationship, we can also call it as a direct relationship, and negative relationship can be called as an inverse relationship. Now, for example, an increase in the price, what happens? When there is an increase in the price, there is an increase in the quantity supplied. When the price increases, the quantity supplied also increases, and vice versa. Vice versa means when there is a decrease in price, what happens to quantity supplied? Quantity supplied also increases. So this is called as positive relationship, because this is also called as negative, very sorry. This is positive relationship can also be mentioned as direct relationship, because the relationship is direct between the two variables. When the price increases, quantity supplied also increases. When the price decreases, quantity supplied also decreases. That's why we call it as a positive relationship. Then what is a negative relationship? When price decreases, what happens? The quantity demanded increases, and vice versa. Vice versa means a decrease in price increases the quantity demanded. So here, what kind of a relationship exists? There is a negative relationship, or we also call it as an inverse relationship. Normally, when you say positive relationship, what will be the shape of the curve? There will be an upward sloping curve. Always positive relationship. When shown in a graph, we get an upward sloping curve. And remember, students, in the case of negative relationship or inverse relationship, when we show that in a graph, we get a downward sloping curve. That is why, if you remember, demand curve is always downward sloping. Why? Because when price increases, the demand decreases. Inverse relationship. So whenever the relationship is an inverse one, we have a downward sloping curve. When the relationship between the two variables are positive, that is when they move in the same direction, we have an upward sloping curve. And since economics deals with variables, almost all variables can be shown in the form of functions. In the two functions, we saw the functional relationship between demand and price and supply and price. Here we considered price as an independent variable. If we consider price as a dependent variable, then the relationship is entirely different. So now let's look into the various uses of functional relationships. Functional relationships are very useful as they serve different purposes. First of all, it enables us to find out relationships between variables. They explain the cause and effect relationships. That is, what happens when some variable changes. What happens to one variable when another variable changes? That is, what happens to the demand when the price increases? Or what happens to demand when the price decreases? That is called as cause and effect relationship. So functions are used to find out the relationships between variables. And secondly, to find out determinants. We know variables are dependent on a number of determinants. Functions point out determinants of variables. That is, now for example, demand may depend upon price, but it depends upon various other determinants also, other factors. This can be understood with the help of functional relationships. And thirdly, we should remember functional relationships actually simplify the description functions. That is, functional relationships are used to simplify the description. One function clearly passes on a number of information. Now, when we write D is equal to F of P, it says demand is a function of price. Demand depends upon price. Demand is a dependent variable. P is an independent variable. Just with these two symbols, everything could be explained, and these functions can be represented in diagrams. So when it is explained in terms of a diagram, it makes the complex things simple. And the next, these functions, that is functional relationships, help to increase clarity and accuracy. Functions always increase the clarity and accuracy of information. They save time, money, and energy of various of the investigators. That's why functions are widely used in economic analysis. Next, let's look into the difference between constants and variables. Remember, economics always deals with measurable quantities. The quantities which retain the same value throughout the analysis are called constants. Those quantities which change their value in the analysis are known as variables. The quantities which retain the same values, that is, those quantities where the values do not change in the analysis, they are called as constants. Meaning to say, they remain as they are. Whereas those quantities which change their value in the analysis are known as variables. To make these concepts more clear, let me explain this with the help of functional relationships. Now let's go back to the same thing, demand function. How do we write demand function? D is equal to F of P. That is, demand has a functional relationship with price. So demand is dependent on price. Both are variables here. Why do we say both are variables? When price varies, demand also varies. The only difference is that price is an independent variable, demand is a dependent variable. But remember, both change. When price changes, demand also changes. So both price and demand are variables. I hope it is clear. When price varies, demand also varies. So we say both are variables. But remember, demand also depends on other factors such as income of the consumer, prices of related goods, and so on. Now let's just, normally in a demand function, what do you say? D is equal to F of P. That is, demand depends on price. We take those two are variables. But in reality, we know demand also depends on other factors such as income of the consumer, prices of related goods. When we say related goods, it could be either substitutes or complementary goods. So it's not that demand depends just on price. Demand depends on various other factors. So how do we explain this in the form of a function? So in that case, we write D is equal to F of price, that is P, Y, that is income, and PR, that is the prices of related goods. So here we are showing all the variables, namely demand is a function of P, that is price, Y, that is income, and PR, that is the prices of related goods. So here you see a number of variables are included in a functional relationship. So when a number of variables are included in a functional relationship, its nature gets more complicated. It gets more difficult to analyze. It's easy to analyze relationship between two variables. Demand is a function of price. We can analyze these two variables. When price changes, how much the demand changes. But when we have all these factors together, namely the price, income, and the prices of related goods, it is very difficult to analyze them. It is not possible to plot them in a graph because we have this two-dimensional graph, x-axis and y-axis, where we can show only two variables. So what do we do? All these variables can be measured, yes. So what do we do? Some of the measurable quantities are assumed to be stable for the time being. These quantities are assumed to be stable, and those quantities which are assumed to be stable or constant. Stable means we assume that they remain constant. These are called as the constants. These are the mathematical terms, namely variables and constant. Now let's go back to the same relation. D is equal to F of P, Y, and PR. I told you it gets very complicated to analyze such a functional relationship when there are several variables. So what do? We assume normally the demand is a function of price, that is P. But we have several other factors such as income and prices of related goods. So what do? We assume that income, that is Y, and PR, that is prices of related goods, we assume them to remain constant. So those quantities are called as constants. I hope it is clear. So similar is the case with the supply function. Here supply function has a positive relationship. That is, when the price increases, supply also increases. So here there are only two variables, namely supply and price. Analysis becomes easy. Both are variables. Supply is a dependent variable, price is an independent variable. But again, things get complicated when there are other factors influencing supply. We know that supply is influenced by number of other factors like cost of production, number of producers, price of related goods, and state of technology. Now just forget about the price. Let's see the relationship between supply and cost of production. When cost of production increases, what happens to supply? Supply decreases. So these are the factors influencing supply. So when we take all these factors, how do we express them? We say, just look into the functional relationship, which can be expressed as S is equal to F of P. P is the price. PR, prices of PR, prices of related goods, cost of production, and the state of technology. P is the price, PR is the price of related goods, PC is the cost of production, N is the number of producers, T is the state of technology. So too many factors influencing supply. In the earlier supply function, we took only two variables, namely supply is a function of price. But here, when we know there are number of factors, how do we express? We say S is equal to F of P, that is price, PR, price of related goods, PC, cost of production, N, number of producers, T, the state of technology. Now, all this influence supply. When technology increases, what happens to supply? Supply also increases. When the number of producers are more, what happens to supply? Supply also increases. So when we consider all these factors, what happens? Very, very difficult to analyze them. So what do? To make it simple, we assume that PR, PC, N, T, that is prices of related goods, cost of production, number of producers, and technology, they all remain constant. So here the supply function considers all other factors except price and supply as constants. So then it becomes easy to analyze. So this is all about the functional relationship and the two concepts, namely constants and variables. Normally, you get this topic for short notes. Okay? But it's very important that you learn this topic. It's not very difficult, it is easy to understand. Just go through it twice or thrice, you will understand well. That's all for now. Thank you.